Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today. We'll give it a few moments as folks start rolling into the room. I've seen those participant numbers go up. Go ahead and make yourself comfortable. We've got a great roster panel of folks here to talk with us today, and we're so glad that you're able to join us in conversation. Feel free to drop a note in the chat. We'd love to know who you are, who's joining us today, where you're calling in from. And we'll get started in about a minute. Kimberly, thank you for letting us know. I thought the chat was enabled. Looks like the chat function is disabled. So while we go ahead and take a look at that, feel free to send us questions using the Q&A function. And we'll be able to kind of respond to those either live or by actually answering your message in chat. I see a thumbs up, so give us some emojis if you have them too. That's terrific. So once again, hello and good afternoon. We're so glad to have you join us today for a conversation on the new nationally representative federal data on college basic needs and security. My name is Leanne Davis, and I'm a managing researcher at Education Northwest. At Education Northwest, we envision a world with excellent and equitable education for all. And we help to realize that vision by using evidence to help our partners solve educational challenges and improve learning. This webinar is one example of how we do that in practice. So the National Post-Secondary Student Aid Study data that was recently released provide a new look at students' experiences in post-secondary education and underscore the challenge of basic needs and security for both graduate and undergraduate students. This study contains the first nationally representative data on food insecurity and homelessness among graduate and undergraduate students enrolled in U.S. post-secondary education. Our goals for today are to highlight the availability of the data from NPSAS 20, equip you with information on how to access and use these data, and discuss the implications of the data and how they might be leveraged to support students. We have a terrific team assembled that we'll be spending the next 90 minutes with. First, Tracy Hunt-White is a statistician in the Sample Surveys Division, Longitudinal Surveys Branch at the National Center for Education Statistics. Thrilled to have her here, and she's going to provide an overview of the National Post-Secondary Student Aid Study and share how the basic needs questions were added to the survey. And then she'll provide an overview of how you can access the data. And next, we'll hear from my colleague, Sarah Golczyk-Rab, who's a senior fellow at Education Northwest. Sarah will speak to us about how to use the data, and we'll definitely have plenty of time for a Q&A at the end of that, at the end of her conversation and presentation. And that Q&A is going to be facilitated by my other colleague at Education Northwest, Michelle Hodara. After that, I will feel really honored to facilitate a panel of experts who are going to share their perspective on why these data are important now and how they plan to leverage the data or even analyses that they'd like to see that will help them continue to be strong advocates for student needs. We will wrap up with plenty of time for Q&A with our panelists and some closing reflections. So it looks like we have the chat all worked out. Thank you so much for that. And we've enabled the chat and the Q&A settings for the webinar. So please feel free to share questions, ideas, reactions as we go. We'll monitor and we'll be able to respond either as we go or during the 2 Q&A portions of our webinar. So without further ado, I'd love to pass the mic over to Tracy and Sarah.
Great. Thank you so much for having me today. I'm really excited to be here and share information about the National Postsecondary Student Aid Study, or NPSAS as we call it. So NPSAS is, as you know, it's just one of many studies conducted by the National Center for Education Statistics. And it's a nationally representative study of undergraduate and graduate students in post-secondary education, and trying to focus on how they finance their education. How are students and their families paying for post-secondary education in a given academic year? So as mentioned, it includes undergraduate students and graduate students, both those with financial aid and without financial aid, attending all types of post-secondary institutions. So from the public institutions, the private nonprofits, the private for-profit institutions, and from the less than 2-year to 4-year institutions. Now, NPSAS is a legislatively mandated data collection to help the government understand its investment in financing students' post-secondary education. So while it is mandatory for NCES to collect the data or to conduct this study, it is not mandatory for institutions or students to participate in the study. So we definitely appreciate when they do respond to our requests. Now, NPSAS has been around for a while. It's been conducted every 3 to 4 years since 1987. And alternating cycles of NPSAS either serve as a base year for a longitudinal study. So it either serves as a base year for the beginning post-secondary students longitudinal study, which follows a cohort of first-time beginning students up to 6 years after entering college, or it serves as the base year for the baccalaureate and beyond longitudinal study, which follows a cohort of bachelor's degree completers up to 10 years after completing their bachelor's degree. For NPSAS, we use several data sources. So of course, we have data from student surveys. We get data from institution student records. And then we have data from various administrative data sources. So we have data from the department's financial aid databases, including data from the free application for federal student aid. We also match to the Veterans Benefits Administration and to the National Student Clearinghouse and match to the admissions testing services. Now, the data you're really interested in comes from our most recent data collection, which is NPSAS 20, which covers the 2019-20 academic year. And in this data collection, as you know, we've added questions on food security, plus additional question on homelessness. Now, this student data collection started in March 2020, just a few weeks before the coronavirus pandemic was declared. And we actually had to pause data collection, but during that time, we were able to add some questions about the early impact of COVID-19 on students. And we actually released a report using preliminary data that shed light on the impact of the pandemic on student enrollment, housing, and finances. And NPSAS 20 is unique in that it's designed to provide both national estimates for undergraduate and graduate students enrolled in all institutions at levels and controls, but there's also allows for state representative estimates for undergraduate students in 30 states overall, and in public 2-year and public 4-year institutions. So you're probably wondering, how were the basic needs questions added to the NPSAS 20 survey? Well, we started exploring this topic in 2015, 2016, when we started hearing from experts on our technical review panel. So people like Sarah were starting to talk about the problem of food and housing security among college students. they felt that this was an important topic to cover in a nationally representative study like NIPSAS. And also, we started receiving communications from department senior leaders and congressional offices on the importance of collecting data on these topics. And then, in addition, we received public comments from researchers, advocates, and practitioners on the importance of covering these topics in our studies. So definitely, given the importance of these topics, we started exploring how we could add items to NIPSAS 20, to the NIPSAS 20 survey. The unique thing about NIPSAS is that we didn't have a field test, so that we couldn't really design questions that ourselves. We really needed to use questions that were already out there and already vetted. So for the food security questions, we collaborated with the U.S. Department of Agriculture to figure out how to include some of their items in the NIPSAS 20 survey. And we also reached out to researchers and experts like at the Hope Center to understand their experiences in capturing this information from college students. So we ended up using the USDA 10-item scale on food security in NIPSAS 20, and we plan on using it in our next data collection as well. Regarding housing security, it was difficult to find an established set of measures on this topic to include in NIPSAS 20, so we ended up adding a question on places ever slept in the last 30 days based on the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act. And for future studies, we'll be looking forward to the work that the Department of Housing and Urban Development is doing on on housing security. Now, I also want to mention that because we were collecting data during the pandemic, we actually added questions regarding food access and housing. So you will find those variables in NIPSAS 20 as well. So how can you access these data? Well, there's a QR code on your screen that takes you to Data Lab. And so you can access these data using our online data tool called PowerStats. And this tool allows you to generate tables, charts, and logistic and linear regressions through an easy-to-use interface. And it's available on the Data Lab website. The micro-level restricted use data will be available this fall. We are working hard on getting it out, so in the next month or two, we anticipate being able to make that data available through a restricted use license. Finally, also this month, we're starting outreach for the 2023-24 NIPSAS study. So we'll be reaching out to institutions seeking their participation in the study. So we hope that if your institution is contacted, that they will participate in the study, of course. If you have any questions about NIPSAS, please feel free to reach out to me. And I just want to thank you for your time, and I look forward to seeing some of the work you do using NIPSAS data. So now I'll turn it over to Sarah.
Thanks so much, Tracy, and it's so good to be with all of you. And I just have to say thank you so much to Tracy and your colleagues. I noticed that we have Jennifer Wine here from RTI, who's an incredibly important partner in the NIPSAS data. And for those who haven't had the pleasure of serving on a technical review panel, I just want you to know it's a lot of work. But it's very rewarding because you get together with a lot of colleagues from around the country, researchers who have to do the hard work of figuring out what the priorities really should be for a survey that is such an enormous opportunity, but that can't take students' time with asking every last question that we ever might want to answer. So folks like Jeff Webster from Trellis, who I know is also on the call, have been in the room as those of us who've been trying to advocate for basic needs and security be measured have had to make the argument that this should be a top priority. And it's really wonderful to see that it has become a priority. And that's why we're here today, as Leanne said, and as Tracy said, to not only tell you about the data and things we can learn from it, but then to listen to ways that practitioners think that we can use it to better advance supports. So my job is to help you all understand a little bit more about the data themselves, to give you some examples of what we're learning from it and what we could learn. And I want to start by really following what Tracy just said and talking a little bit nuts and bolts about how to use the basic needs and security data in NIPSAS because of course, if we don't use things correctly, then we're going to get incorrect estimates, and that's going to be troubling for our work. So the first thing that you need to know is, as Tracy said, the measure that was used for food insecurity by NCES in the NIPSAS is the 10-item USDA measure. And as you may know, they had options. Other options would have been a 2-item measure, a 6-item measure, or even an 18-item measure, which is particularly useful for people with children because it helps you also get a sense of who's in their household and how they're doing in terms of food insecurity. The USD item, 10-item, is a very good measure. It's one that we used at the Hope Center for a long time. It's one that many other researchers use. So this is a really helpful thing to have. As you pull up the data and you look at it, I want to make sure that you think about 2 different things. The first thing is that it is based on how a student was doing in the 30 days prior to the survey, and that's it. So in other surveys, you may have seen measures, and for example, in the Real College survey, we've always reported measures that are both 30-day and 12-month. And what you have here is 30-day, and that's fine. It's just that it's a limitation that we all need to be cognizant of. Secondly, the way that the data are reported, when you pull them up in Power Stats, you can see the percentage of students in each of 4 categories. Secure, which essentially means the student is fine in terms of food security. Those who are minimally secure, those who have low security, and those who have very low security. The way that food insecurity is meant to be calculated using this measure, you're supposed to pair together low and very low. And thankfully, PowerStats is actually making this very easy. It's easy to do a quick recode where you redefine the variable to equal low plus very low. And that's really, really important because if you want to compare this to any other numbers out there, that is how food insecurity is measured by virtually all other research. So that's the first thing. The second thing is with regard to homelessness. And Tracy explained the reasons why we don't yet have nationally representative numbers on housing insecurity. We have a single measure of homelessness. It is a very decent measure. I would argue it is far better than the measure that we had to date, which is simply whether or not a student is homeless based on the FAFSA. I think many of us working in the field for a long time understand the limitations of that, including the fact that there are many students who don't even complete the FAFSA who may in fact be homeless. And also, of course, the FAFSA is difficult to complete, and it is especially difficult to complete if you are actually going through these challenges and you may not qualify. So this measure is also a 30-day measure. And I want to flag that in particular because, again, in other surveys, including the Real College survey, we have historically measured homelessness over 12 months rather than in 30 days, recognizing that the trauma that can result from homelessness can affect a student for far longer, well beyond a 30-day period, and that a 30-day period might not capture everything. That said, we're grateful to have a 30-day measure, and that is what's in there. And I want to flag that really critically, because this has been a debate in the field, it includes both sheltered and unsheltered homelessness. For a long time, people were not counting couch surfing, which is honestly the dominant student experience when it comes to homelessness. They were not capturing that as homelessness, and here it is. And so that is very, very well done, and I'm really, really glad to see that. I'll go ahead and go to the next slide, but I want to note that as Michelle is saying, the Q&A is open. If you have questions about anything that Tracy said or that I said, we're going to take Q&A at the end of my remarks before the panel begins. The next thing that's really wonderful about the NIPSAS data is that the survey, the broader survey that's done of students, captures a lot of very rich information. And if you've ever done a survey and you're trying to ask all these questions of students, you know that it can get very time-consuming for students and also very expensive from a research side to be able to ask this huge range of questions. And so we're really grateful that we have a lot of different variables and concepts that we can look at in the data to compare with these rates of basic needs insecurity. So for example, there are a whole range of indicators that you can choose to use to look at a student's race and ethnicity. And to their credit, NCES has already coded up a lot of that so that you can choose, for example, if you want to use a measure that has a student in one category or in multiple categories, reflecting the various ways that they could have identified. They do have a measure of sex in there. They also have a measure of sexuality. They have a measure of age. They have a measure of income. They have a measure of parental income and students' income. They have a lot of interesting measures of students' lives, including whether that student has dependents, and also a measure of whether that student has children, because of course there are some people who are dependents who are not children, and you can get into all of that. You can also get into student employment as it compares to basic needs insecurity. You can look at students' disabilities, and there's a lot of detailed information in there. You can analyze it based on whether a student has any disability or whether they have a specific type. And there's a whole range of information in there about the financial supports that they're receiving, not just from financial aid, but from a range of different sources. There's also a lot of detailed information on a student's academic experiences. This is really important. The data themselves, if you go into Data Lab, you go into one area if you want to look at the NIPSAS for undergraduates, and you go into another area if you want to look at the NIPSAS for graduate students. And really incredibly, the basic needs data has been collected for both groups. And so that's really terrific. So the way to do that is to run your analyses in one area and then run your analyses in the other area. You can also look at things like enrollment intensity, full-time, part-time, past educational experiences, and then you can go in as well and look at a bunch of institutional level variables. So for example, if you were curious about what basic needs insecurity looks like in the for-profit colleges, you can now do that. And I say that because for the longest time, we didn't have any idea what basic needs insecurity rates looked like in for-profit colleges and universities because they weren't volunteering to do surveys. And if they were doing surveys, they weren't releasing that information. Interestingly, we can also dig in even farther among minority serving institutions. We can look at different types of them. We can look at HBCUs. We can look at HSIs. We can look, for example, at how basic needs insecurity varies by the percentage of Pell recipients at an institution or by its racial composition and so on. And then, of course, we can also look at things like, does basic needs insecurity exist among students who are at what I and others call highly rejective institutions? Akil Bello uses that phrase, and he's referring to places where it's extremely hard to get in because of things like test score requirements. Do students, even at places where they have all of that exclusionary gatekeeping in place, still deal with basic needs insecurity, often even though they have a lot of wealth? Well, the answer I can tell you from looking at it is yes, and we can go further and try to dig into that. We can also look at things like their mode of instruction. So for example, are students taking classes in hybrid settings, online only, or in person only? So this is just the beginning of the range of things that you could look at. And that's yet another reason why we really want to encourage as many people as possible to take a look at these data. Go ahead and go to the next slide, please, Jeff. Okay, so just to give you a sense, if you have not yet seen already some of the analyses that are coming out, this shows us some of the most important information. So we now have a nationally representative estimate for the first time in the history of the country. We know that just under 1 in 4 students at the undergraduate level are dealing with food insecurity. And we can also see that that rate is so much higher for students who identify as Black or African American. In fact, it's 35%. And so this is really the first time that we know that, this is a leading problem that is affecting very large groups of people who have higher rates of non-completion than others. We can also, as I noted, look at the community colleges and disparities within the community college students. We can do the same thing for 4 years, and we can do the same thing for for-profits. This is, again, just a flavor. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. And just to give you a sense of all of the different types of disaggregated analyses we can do, what I did here was disaggregate the prevalence of homelessness rates, which is 8% overall for undergraduates. We can see that rates are somewhat lower for undergraduates working full-time, but not that much lower. It's honestly it's about 7%. So working full-time does not seem to shield you from experiencing homelessness in college, which is just horrendous. We can see that being enrolled full-time doesn't mean that you're not dealing with homelessness. We can see that students in the data who are categorized as genderqueer or non-conforming have higher rates of homelessness, along with students who identify as having some sort of disability, or those who have been an orphan or ward of the state. And these are all topics of great policy interest and, of course, great interest when it comes to equity work. Next slide, please. So, as Tracy noted, there are a number of things in addition to working with the data themselves that we can do. First of all, we can start to begin to think about not only what it looks like to look at a cross-section of students, which is what we have here, but also to look at dynamics over time. So the beginning post-secondary students longitudinal study will allow us to examine how basic needs insecurity relates to, for example, graduation. And to be able to look at how students' finances over time, for example, relate to basic needs insecurity. So as you think about what you want to do with NPSAS data, please also think about what you want to do with the BPS data. Secondly, I really do encourage you to get a restricted use license from NCES if possible, so that you can get the most detailed information. There might be variables that you want to get into that are not in the public access data lab, and you need a license to use it. That can take a little bit of time. Having done it myself, I can say, though, it is a doable process. Particularly if you're at an institution that has done a license before, it shouldn't be that difficult, but you do need to plan ahead for that. And then I do want to put out a call for some additional advocacy. You know, as Tracy noted, the team at NCES is responding to the field's interests, responding to public policy interests, and so on. And there are areas where we need to keep on building on these data. First and foremost, unfortunately, we do not yet have measures of students' use of public benefits programs. And we know that this is a very critical type of a way that we can be supporting students. For example, the USGAO did a report several years ago, and there's another one forthcoming about students' use of SNAP. I want to caution you that there is a measure of SNAP use in these data, but it is not a measure of whether students were using SNAP during college. It is a measure of whether their families received SNAP in the time that they were before college. So it's more of a measure, for example, of poverty of the family than it is of students' ongoing use, and it really can't be compared to current food insecurity rates in any meaningful way. So we should advocate for that. We do need to get to a point where we see housing insecurity measured in here because, for example, students struggle with rent, the consequences of the end of eviction moratoriums in light of housing unaffordability crises, for example. These are real things that we need to have better numbers on. And just to highlight one population, there's a lot of work on foster care, former foster youth and their college experiences. And there is a distinction to be made between the current category, which is orphans and wards of the state, seemingly kind of lumped together with foster care, at least in the data lab. And I think that it's worth some advocacy to try to ensure that we get a clearer measure of that so that we can build on it. Next slide, please. Okay, so and we will also drop a link here if needed, but there is a QR code on the screen for my analyses, the full details of the analyses that I just showed you. All of these are now contained in the free Real College Resource Library, which I have put together on my website, which is a fully searchable library chock full of all of the data and research and materials that were put together, many of which led to NCES taking these steps and building these data. So you can search in there to see, for example, what we were learning before. You can do comparisons if you want to past information and past data, and you can get these analyses and anything new that we put up. And so now I'm just going to pause for a moment to look at the Q&A and to see what we are asking about that I can help answer. So Heather, thank you for being here. You asked, is the data catching roommates or housemates or just parenting students in the food insecurity data? I don't believe that it is capturing, it's not really asking about people in your household in these questions. It's asking about the student themselves. So that's in the 10 item. In the 18 item, I believe that the language is more specific to be sure that it's asking about children rather than, for example, roommates who live with you. But the 18 item, again, is not in these data. And someone else asks, is there just one measure of homelessness, not split between sheltered and unsheltered? That is correct. At least from the data that I have seen at this point, the measure that we have is not split. It is possible that in the restricted use, maybe you can disaggregate that. I'm not entirely sure. Tracy, if at any point you want to, do you know if it's going to be delivered any other way?
So in the restricted use file, it has all the interview items on there. So you can actually look and see what they selected.
Wonderful.
Yeah, for that item.
You could do a disaggregated analysis.
Correct.
That's terrific.
And Sarah, there was an additional question in the chat about whether or not we could look at this by rural and suburban town. And you can. There's a variable in there called locale that will let you look at that distinction as well.
That's wonderful. There's so many folks who are interested in that. One thing that I will share before we move on to the panel is that, and Tracy, you and I had some back and forth about this. I was curious if we would be able to do these analyses by state, because I'm sure many of you know that states are extremely interested in knowing their own information. And in the past, my team and others have done work at the state level. There are some state level analyses possible with the new NIPSAS, particularly around financial aid. But the survey data, as I understand it, is not available at state level for state level analyses. Is that correct, Tracy?
That is correct. And thank you for that clarification. Yeah, the data on food insecurity and homelessness are only available for those who responded to the survey. But then we have this large administrative sample, where we did not have, they were not asked the survey. So there's no data on food insecurity. And
Yes.
Sarah, while we're here, through my presentation, I never mentioned RTI International, who is our partner in data collection here. So I just want to send out kudos to them, because Jennifer Wine and her team have done a lot of work in making sure that we add these questions and get good quality data in our NIPSAS studies.
Good. I think we'll just do one more. I'll quickly answer Christina's question. This research is nationally representative. This is a sample from all 50 states, which is why this is so incredibly valuable. This isn't, the analyses I just showed were my analyses, but these data are not mine. These are federal data. And that was the real triumph of the NIPSAS data collection, was that the feds took control of actually asking and getting these questions answered. And by the way, they paid for it. So the question on the screen is around how did we obtain for-profit college information if colleges are not always so forthcoming? And that has to do with how the NIPSAS actually engages colleges in that part of the sampling process. So Tracy, with your permission, I'd love to have you answer that one.
Oh, certainly. So for NIPSAS, it's a two-stage sampling process. So we sample institutions of all types and request their enrollment lists. And from those enrollment lists, we sample students. And then we start surveying students. And then we also go back to the institution for additional information. So those types of institutions have been forthcoming in terms of providing us with the list of their students so that we can survey them.
Yep. It's very different when the federal government comes asking, I think, and I think that's wonderful. So good. Okay, with that, I'm going to be turning it back over to Leanne so that we can listen to some experts in the field who are trying to serve students, talk about how they can make use of these data and what we can do with them. Thank you.
Great. Sarah, thank you so much. And thank you also, Tracy, for sharing all that information with us. Now it's my honor to introduce you to our expert panel. We have John King, who is Chancellor of the State University of New York and the 10th U.S. Secretary of Education, Francis Villagrán Glover, who is the Houston Community College Interim Vice Chancellor for Student Services and President of Southeast College, Tamil Gilkerson, President and CEO of Evergreen Valley College, and also co-chair of the CEO Affordability, Food and Housing Access Task Force at the Community College League of California. And then Keith Curry, who is chair of Level Up for Black Students and the president and CEO of Compton College. So thank you all for joining us today. I am really excited to hear from you and hear what you have to share. So I thought I'd have a question to get us started. And Tamil, I'm wondering if I can kick it over to you first. If you can maybe share your perspective on why having this new nationally representative federal data on college basic needs and security is so important right now, or what some of the biggest challenges that we face when it comes to meeting students' basic needs, and how this data might help improve that work.
Well, thanks so much, Leanne. And thank you, really. I'm so excited to be here and excited to celebrate this incredible milestone that we have access to this data. And, really, honestly, the fact that we have, we know why we need the data is because ultimately we don't believe students in this country, right? So we can have and continue to understand. As a CEO on a college campus, I can see directly the impact where even my student intern was homeless and living in her car. Even students who are working are fighting to put food on the table and do particular things. And we didn't have tools and resources to be able to measure and see what it is that our students are experiencing in real time. And so to have access to the federal data that can be disaggregated and looked at provides us with the lens to be able to do advocacy and the pieces that we need. And so we feel like it's important now just because we've come to a point, right, with the cost of inflation and the things that's going on and the lived experiences that we're all feeling. We know our students are even more unstable these days than they ever have been before. And certainly our efforts in California, when we serve 1.9 million students and are the largest higher education system in the nation, it's really important for us to really realize how we start to develop solutions that can be done sort of nationwide and things that work directly for our region. So grateful to be part of the panel today.
Thank you, Tamil. John, wondering if we can turn it over to you next.
Sure. Look, I would build on those points to say that the advocacy means we're trying to get resources to solve these challenges. And at SUNY, I started in January, and one of the first things I did was visit all 64 of our campuses. And despite having worked on these issues as secretary, as commissioner of education in New York, running Education Trust, a civil rights organization, I still was so deeply unsettled by the frequency with which students talked about food and housing insecurity, as well as other basic needs insecurity, as I visited campuses. And so, where this data can be helpful is taking the action necessary. At SUNY, we were able to dedicate state funding to ensure that we're supporting food pantries at every campus and getting them things like refrigerators, helping them expand those pantries to include toiletries, menstrual products. But we know that's a Band-Aid. So we also put resources towards helping students navigate the SNAP process, got our data team to create a tool to help students access SNAP benefits. We're working with Benefits Data Trust to work with a pilot set of campuses using their toolkit to help students navigate the SNAP application process, because that is a more sustainable source of funding than just going to the food pantry. We designated homeless liaisons on every campus, following the sort of model of McKinney-Vento, and are working with Schoolhouse Connections to provide a community of practice for those homeless liaisons. And we're trying to tackle some of the other basic needs and security issues that overlay with housing and food insecurity, where students are forced to choose between, should I buy lunch or should I pay for the Uber that I need to get home? So we're working with Selden Herring Foundation on partnering campuses with local government and local transit agencies to address access to public transportation within a reasonable distance of campuses with reasonable frequency, so folks aren't making those choices between transportation and basic needs.
Thanks for sharing all that with us. It's so powerful to hear what all of you are doing kind of in your campuses and in your systems to help students. And Francis, I'm sure that you have a lot more to add to this as well.
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. Great to see everybody, my colleagues. The state of Texas, there's a lot going on in the state of Texas, and I don't see anybody from Texas, but maybe they're out there. But there's two big things that I think are going to help with our work, with this critical work. And I'll always remember a conversation that Sarah and I had, 6 years ago, and we kept on calling food insecurity, homelessness, transportation issues at the college as non-academic barriers, right? And Sarah kept on reminding me and reminding us that they're not non-academic barriers. These are academic barriers. So back to what John and Tamil were saying, how critical the whole holistic student support system, what we do, how critical that is. And I think our faculty and our faculty have lived with this and their students for a very long time, right? But I think it's the policymakers that they really need to understand that it's just not an ancillary, it's just not a one-time thing, but it really incorporates the whole student and their success. And there's two things that I want to mention. Effective September 1, Texas funding model for community colleges has changed, right? We're now a performance funding model. So even more than ever, our student outcomes are critical. We won't get funded if our students do not complete. So we really worked hard the past 6 years, thanks to Sarah and her team, with our real college efforts. We've been involved with the survey, and since then we've grown our food markets. We don't call them food pantries. Like John had mentioned, we have advocates. There's also another law that came into effect in Texas, SB 459, supporting parenting students, right? And so those are students, and it's a large proportion of our students who are either caregivers or have children of their own. Now we're by law have to provide them with priority registration, because we know their schedules are busy and we need to really advocate for them, and having a liaison, like John had mentioned, an advocate for them to help them along. So while these laws, some laws are challenging, but I think the one with supporting parenting students is a big step forward.
Thank you, Francis. Keith, we'd love to hear from you.
There's not too much more that I can add regards to the national piece, but I think for me locally, what I think about is we continue to ask students how poor they are on applications to receive services, right? And from my perspective, I think we got to continue to focus on how we provide the program and services as relates to basic needs to all students, and they don't have to fill out an application to be able to receive those services. And so I'm a proponent of colleges providing the service to all students, not just to providing the food pantry. At Compton College, every student and employee gets 1 meal per day. We have a farmer's market every Wednesday. They get $20. They'll buy groceries and healthy food. But our data showed in the past that students had food insecurity. And so we're really focused on that. So being able to have the national data, be able to do some comparisons, especially this area about race, is going to help us a lot with our programming. And when we look at our programming moving in the future, is really pushing more students to SNAP. And how can we get more students on our campuses to be able to enroll in SNAP? And being able, SNAP is being utilized at our cafeteria, within our vending machines, but really looking at how you change your entire institution to support students around SNAP. Over the last 4 years, we have been able to hire someone full-time specifically responsible for SNAP, making sure students are signed up for SNAP. But we also have a data sharing agreement with the County of Los Angeles to share information regards to SNAP participation. And so we have to be able to look at the whole school approach of being able to provide those services, because I don't feel that the food pantries are enough. I don't feel providing housing stipends is enough. And one of these, when I look at housing at Compton College, we're in the process of building 250 beds, student housing for our students. And so the national data is helping us not only look at housing, food insecurity, and programming, but also helps us with our advocacy. And under the direction of Dr. Gilkerson and our task force, we've been able to do a lot of work regards to advocacy based off of previous data. So now we'll be able to do some national data comparisons, will be very helpful. But in California, we've been able to advocate for student housing dollars to support community colleges. We've been able to advocate for SNAP being offered in cafeterias at community college campuses. We've been able to advocate for other programs and services that support our students based off of basic needs. But that's been because of the task force utilizing that data as a way of advocacy. And we have produced many reports, but having a national perspective is going to help us to show this was happening in California, but also this was happening throughout the nation. And the last piece of this is the disaggregation of the data by race. As you can see, it was mentioned in the presentation, the impact basic needs are having on Black students. And what can we do to support those students in order for them to be successful? That's critical because you have some good conversations on your campuses to be able to talk about, okay, what is happening with these particular groups? And I think that's what's needed as we move forward from a national perspective.
Yeah, and I just want to follow up on what Dr. Curry said, Keith said, and I think it's really important to like really frame the fact that we're talking about the access to federal data. And so let me give you an example. The CEOs in California said, we want to measure and understand what's going on our campuses around basic needs. We are individually signing up to do this. And it is a community of CEOs leading the effort, right, to do our own data collection. And so we're proud and privileged that we just led our own survey in the spring and published a report that had over 66,000 students in 88 of our 116 colleges report. And so part of the thing that's really important about what Sarah and Tracy said is this: how do we use and leverage this federal data? So one of the things that our data elevated, which Sarah talked about in the federal data, is that three quarters of California students, regardless of their basic needs status, were working or looking for work, right? So this is not an issue of students not having the tenacity to go to school and work and do all this stuff. They are actually, and if they work more hours per week, their homelessness varied based on these outcomes, right? So the data is really clear. And the fact that the federal Pell grant is $7,395. It's disrespectful, frankly. I don't mean to be, but I was a Pell Grant recipient. I'm a first generation college student. It doesn't pull people out of poverty, and $7,395 barely covers 2 months rent here in San Jose or in Oakland, in the Silicon Valley, in the Bay Area. I know that's the same in New York and in Houston and multiple places. And so the fact that, right, when we look at these racialized outcomes too, that nearly 60% of African-American and Black students are Pell Grant recipients, that roughly half of American Indian and Alaska Native and Latinx students are actually Pell Grant recipients, about half of student parents, and I saw student parent advocates here on the stage, and nearly 40% of student veterans are getting the Pell Grant. Like, what are we saying to people when we can't actually do this? So we have to nationally work on doubling the Pell, if not even tripling it, changing the reform, and actually calling on folks to say, this is not a college issue. This is a freaking national health crisis and wellness crisis. Sorry to be so passionate, but this is anyways, okay.
And Dr. Gerkenson,
Don't apologize.
I just want to add to that a little bit, because you got me going, is that it's a national conversation, but we can no longer sit on the sidelines and say, oh, this is what's happening with Pell. It's not going to happen in Washington, D.C. We just got to wait. No, we have to advocate with our elected officials nationally, regardless of what party they're in, regardless of the needs of our students. And now we have that data to do that. But we have to advocate and be unapologetic about it. We can no longer be on the sidelines and be like, okay, hopefully it happens in the next year. No, every year we have to be in this game and fighting for our students. Because if we don't do it, who else will?
Thank you so much for that. And definitely don't be apologetic about being passionate and doing the right thing for students and advocating for students. You're both all of you on the screen are such exemplars and models for those, the rest of us in the field who are doing this work. I see a lot of laudatory comments thanking you for your commitment to this work and for speaking truth to power. Thanks, Bryce, for adding that. I know Francis and John, we kind of went off on this great conversation about, how you're collecting data on your campuses. And I'm wondering if there's anything else that the two of you wanted to add, either, about how you're doing this at Houston Community College or, what you're doing at SUNY.
Well, John, I'll go ahead. That's why they call Keith the Avenger, right? He's, him and his group are the true Avengers. And it's just, is great. It's really, I just shout out, and we really need to be unapologetic about our fight. It's really a fight for advocacy and truth and access for our students. So like I mentioned, because of our funding model, we're really being more intentional about the data that we receive, and the data that Sarah just presented and the other team presented is going to really help us move our outcomes and our strategies around supporting students. And also, as a president, my other hat is, when I talk to funders, right? When I talk to community-based organizations about their support, their needs for support and philanthropic fundraising, until we get Pell straight, right? Until we get financial aid straight, we're still going to have to fight for other financial resources to help our students. And we're grateful that, I'm grateful that I have a great foundation board who's exceeded the amount, and they understand the basic needs issues that our students have. And so I think, leveraging that data in support of our students.
Well, I would just add, I think one of the challenges of this conversation is everybody on this Zoom agrees, right? And so, it does always feel good to the preacher to preach to the choir, but ultimately we've got to find a way to persuade folks who are still not appreciating the scale of challenges that college students face. And so, I really want to appreciate Sarah for being dogged about making sure that this data would be captured. I want to appreciate Tracy and her colleagues at NCS, whose work is often unsung, but is vital to moving the sector forward. And then we've got to figure out how to turn these data into stories, right? Because if you go to a reporter and you say, here's the data, they often are reluctant to turn that into a story unless you can say, let me introduce you to this student who's trying to become a nurse, a single mom trying to raise her daughter, and here are the choices that they're forced to make around housing and food insecurity. And we've got to help tell those stories. We've got to tell them in the press. We got to tell them to the local chamber and business council, right? We've got to get unlikely allies to join us. Think about the fact that as a country, we let the earned income tax credit expansion expire. We'd made progress reducing child poverty by nearly half, and then we walked away from it as a country with almost not a peep, very little noise around that. So we have to see this as a moment, I think, to organize and to use these data to reach out to not just legislators, but community leaders who can push legislators to deliver on SNAP expansion, earned income tax credit expansion, childcare subsidy expansion. Because ultimately, these big policies, we need a bigger coalition.
I think that's a really good point. I also wanted to just raise that, right? We have so many people in the space, right? So where's the continuum between K through 12, right? How are we actually thinking about community-based organizations, our counties, our, the localities and the regional things, to stop sort of recreating the wheel at every point, right? So, we need to be doing it large scale, as you said, John, but also be looking directly at the places where we're just continuing to have barriers. Like, we shouldn't have access barriers in regional areas around transportation, like you were talking about. Like, what is it we're doing, just from even statewide and federal sort of things to say, why do we consistently have these things? And so this sort of data and being able to mine and see that many of the shared outcomes that we have. And so when I've shared data with community-based organizations, they're like, we're looking for it too. We're working on the same issue to address like single parents and their completion, or, homelessness and their completion. And so the opportunity for us to all have a data set that we can use together, because our students are our nation's students, our students are citizenry of, these United States. And so I think it's really important for us to take what you said to heart and also continue to work large scale and at the local level.
Yeah, thanks for highlighting that that important point, because so much of this can be accomplished at the regional level. And you don't need, especially if you have multiple colleges within the same geographic area and you have community-based organizations and partners, you don't all need to be doing this individually, right? How do you come together in community, form a partnership to address these issues that are affecting our community members, right? Our neighbors, the people that are down the street from us, the people that you might run into at the grocery store, kids, our kids might be in school together. They're humans, they're people. Yeah.
But I would also say, as I think about this conversation, is that I've been involved in this real college movement since 2016, 2017. We have come a long way, right? So I think we can be proud of how far we have come since we begun having these conversations about student basic needs. Now, the question will be, what does it look like in the future? And how do we work together in the future in order to continue to double down our efforts as relates to student basic needs? But I don't want to push back all the good work that's been happening nationally around this conversation and thinking more about, as Dr. King mentioned, of how do we tell those student stories to the individuals who are not in this room, right? To the individuals who are not a part of the choir, right? And we need those individuals now more than ever, especially when we start to look at the Pell and the total cost of tuition, right? Really have those real conversations with individuals who are not ready to have that conversation, but we need them in the conversation.
Yeah. Thank you. And it's kind of a segue into my next, just a next question for you. I'm curious, what help do you need in doing this that you don't currently have?
For me, when I talk about help, is learning more about programs and services colleges are doing and universities are doing to support students' basic needs. I look at LinkedIn, I look at X, just to try and find out what people are doing. If they have reports, I just love to find out what other people are doing. For example, I saw a college, I think it was in the Midwest, and I tagged one of my staff, was they did a basic needs like a fair, right? And I was like, oh, that's cool. We never done that before, where all the support for basic needs are having a fair for students to be able to sign up for services. So you're trying to not have silos and doing a fair. So my thing is just, how can we continue to highlight and uplift some of the best practices that are happening across the country and really share those best practices with individuals like myself, because we can learn from each other. I think what we're doing at Compton College is great work, but I also know there's other great work that's being done that we can learn from, and being open and learning from other campuses will be helpful. But also those campuses are saying, hey, come learn from us, right? We're doing good work as well. But to highlight those campuses, colleges and universities that are doing this great work so we can learn from each other.
Yeah, back to it. So a playbook, right? There's various playbooks out there, but just building on the various playbooks that we've been exposed to is really helpful for me. Something that John said about, singing to the other choir or singing to other groups who may not understand is, when we opened up our food market, we not only invited students who are going to utilize it, but we really invited community members who are on the other side who really didn't understand. And so leveraging things like that, and Keith reminded me of that, looking at what other people are doing to leverage and really tell the story, because data is one set, but really being there is another level.
I think for me, part of the what I could use help, and I think the state and all of us could do is just regular access to data that's actually disaggregated in a way that really helps us tell the stories that were talked about. So, ultimately for me, when I think about the work that we've had to do to just get the data and the reports and put data in the hands of colleges to be able to have this on a regular basis has been sort of volunteer, out of love for what we want to do. And I think what was most telling in the data that we just recently released just earlier at the end of September is the fact that this continues to be a racial equity issue, right? This continues to be systematic and structural barriers to historically underrepresented and minoritized and marginalized communities. And the data helps us tell that story. So when I have students saying, that transgender students are far greater at, in every single indice of actually being insecure, it's our community's problem together to help solve that, right? It's the same thing when we see continued things for those who've been formerly convicted of a crime, or foster youth, as Sarah lifted up earlier, or, you know, those who are single parents, right? 9 out of 10 single parents in our study show, right, that they had basic needs insecurities across the board. This is an intergenerational issue. And so I think part of it is having, you know, access to, like, not requiring us to pay for our own data. It's like asking students to pay to take a test, right, by buying a blue book and a Scantron. I mean, we continue to just sort of put barriers in front of leaders who want to do really good work and practitioners who want to do it. And so I think part of it is, like, you know, is allowing us the opportunity to have the access to being able to leverage and ask these questions so we can tell the stories.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I would ask for researchers to think about is really diving into some of the disaggregated data and partnering with advocacy organizations to tell focused stories. So I think about a group like Generation Hope and their work around supporting student parents. You know, if we can take the student parent slice of the data here, tell that story, flesh that out, do lots of media on telling that story. You know, I want my campus presidents and my campus college councils to hear that on NPR as they're driving to work in the morning, hear the story of Generation Hope telling the story about this data and student parents, or an organization like the National Black Justice Coalition and their work on LGBTQ folks of color and disproportionate challenges faced there. So that would be one thing that would be very helpful from researchers, from journalists. Another way to leverage the data is also trying to think creatively around policy solutions that people have missed. You know, so you think about enrollment challenges. You know, are there ways that we can simplify how you enroll for different programs so that you don't have to fill out a whole separate set of forms? And we may not be able to do that for federal policy, but at least it's state policy. We should be thinking about, how do we just make it easier? How do we shift some things that are opt-in to opt-out so that we can provide, as Keith was describing, a service automatically to folks? We need help thinking about those creative solutions.
Thanks also for sharing those and for making that kind of bridge to what you're hoping that you might see researchers undertake, and what kind of data or analyses are really going to help you to continue to advocate for meeting students' basic needs. Tamil, thank you also for so passionately describing kind of the importance of high quality disaggregated data and continuing to use that, and John making the connection to telling the story and partnering with advocacy organizations who kind of have the ability to to put a face behind that with the data, and to get out there and kind of use all of their, like, leverage all of their connections to continue to build that and get awareness. What else do you want to add?
Yeah, no, so I think, Leanne, like, there's, you know, California is a great example. So, you know, Keith shared earlier, right? Like, if I stand back and look at the trajectory of the work that's happened in California, we are in a much different place than we were, you know, just even 5 years ago, right? And I can look no farther than just looking at the legislature and their support for student housing, right? So again, California community colleges, there were only a handful in very regional pockets where it was very hard for students to get to that had student housing. We aren't in the business of student housing. And ultimately, through the 2020 Budget Act, through the Higher Education Student Housing Grant Program came, and it really funded community colleges $546.6 million in construction grants, another $17.9 million in planning grants so that colleges could work on feasibility studies to find out what's needed, right? And we've already begun funding 12 projects. We've got 7 recently authorized, and, you know, 70 colleges are in the pipeline, right? So, you know, again, a housing solution at these colleges for our students is a housing solution for families. It's a housing solution, right, for California. So we've been able to sort of leverage some of the things. We now have basic needs centers at our campuses that are, you know, through mandate, through the legislature. And so there is this ability to use the data. So the data is helping us, right? If we didn't have the data that we had, we wouldn't have been able to get to the point that we are. And so I think part of it is, how do we keep the funding, right? And, you know, in lean budget times, how do we make sure that we can show the data that shows that students who are actually doing better, if we're meeting their basic needs, right? In college, that's the data shows us. And so I think those are the things that we can band together and really, to your point, be leveraging for not only just understanding our communities and going deeper, particularly in disproportionately impacted groups, to understand root causes, but also being able to address things nationally together.
Are there any other thoughts that you'd like to share about maybe examples of how you've leveraged data to drive policy conversations?
We have done that at Compton. We utilize our data based off of food insecurity, which is set us up to be able to provide 1 meal per day. But we also were able to utilize the data from our study we did on our employees, where we know that our employees were challenged with food insecurity, and that allowed them for us to make sure that they participate as well. One thing I want to go back to a little bit regards to what can be done. I think having researchers talk more often about the data will be helpful, where researchers are having conversations about the data and their interpretation of the data. I think that would be a good thing. But then also having more spaces for practitioners who are doing the work on the campus level to be able to learn from other colleges is great. And I saw Sarah dropped in the chat the resource page. But to be able to have conversations about those resources, I think that would be helpful as well. I think people are all trying to figure it out, but being able to have those spaces will be helpful. And then also, too, celebrating individuals who are doing great work in this space. Saying, you know, Dr. Gerkenson, the stuff you've done for California community colleges the last 3 years has been amazing. And your leadership for us has led to another study being done, but a lot of our advocacy, but really saying thank you to individuals who are doing this work and uplifting them, because you know what, being a CEO of a community college, but also doing statewide or national work in this space is hard because it's an extra job. And so being able to uplift these individuals is important, and saying thank you to those people as well, because the work that's being done locally, statewide, and nationally is benefiting our campuses. And not everyone is in these spaces doing it.
One thing that I would add, this is kind of this is maybe going from the macro policy to very micro, but it's something that Sarah has emphasized a lot, and that really impacted me as an educator. You know, when I before I took this job, I was teaching at Maryland, and I put the basic needs insecurity statement on my syllabus, just helping students know where the services were and encouraging them to talk with me and my TA if they needed help. And I have to say, it was another reminder that even though services may be available on campus, students may not know where to find them. You know, we act like all those 800 workshops and handouts you get in the first week of school are supposed to be enough to really know how to navigate. And to the extent that we can convince our colleagues one by one, or you know, ideally at campus level, to use those kinds of statements on syllabi, I think that's very powerful. The other thing is to really try to remove some of the shame around this. And one of the reasons to tell the stories, and also to have faculty and staff share their stories, is so that you take away the shame that causes students to hide or to not seek out the help.
And it's all tied into also the mental health, right, John? And you know, it's okay. We all go through hard times. We're all human beings first and foremost, right? What I hear Sarah and her team say. Perhaps not related to policy directly, but you asked a question, Leanne, about how we use the data and how we leverage it. I know it has driven our advising efforts. It's also through our accreditation, through our quality enhancement plan. We have personalized learning now, so that when an advisor sits with a student, they just not talk about their academic planning, but they talk about their life, right? Tell me a little bit more, from moving it from transactional to relationship. right? So, as I talked to Tamil, like, Tamil, tell me a little bit more about yourself, right? And not to have so intrusive questions, but it may come out like, Tamil, she may be a single parent. I might just say, hey, do you know that we have these resources for you, or a daycare on center? It goes back to John's comment about, these workshops we provide or these brochures. There's two things our students don't have that we all understand, right? They don't have a lot of money and they don't have a lot of time. And so really being intentional about really putting it out there without being so intrusive and saying and labeling them like, oh, you need help. It looks like you need help, right? And really advocating for them.
Yeah, and you, Francis, I really appreciate that. And one of the things that I've been thinking about is, again, as we build out infrastructure and stuff, we have to continue to think about what it means on our campuses for our practitioners, right? This is trauma work for a lot of our communities, right? This is transference of like sort of energy and pieces like that. So, I just sat in a statewide conference the other day with a lot of student success coaches who were saying like, this is heavy to hear from people like, for it's elevating, right? Who may have these things and I don't know how best to do it. And I want to be supportive of them. So, I'm also thinking that the data not only helps frame what we do, but we also have to move that and shift that to the next iteration of what we're thinking. Do we have enough staff in our financial aid offices to, actually really spend time with people to make sure that everybody's getting things, or are we still transactional? Do we have enough staffing to be able to do the basic needs work versus one person in the center? And we say, that's enough. And so I think part of that usage of that and in the change of funding formulas and pieces like that is that we actually at individual levels in our roles as CEOs and, leaders of systems is to be able to say, let's take a second to think about this, because the reform we work for will never have its ends if we don't actually change the entire system that's wrapped around it.
So many great thoughts to share here. And if I can go back 1 second, the syllabus statements are so powerful. And I'm PhD program at the University of Washington, and it is has been front and center on the syllabus in every course that I've been enrolled in this fall. And it makes me I feel so proud to see that. And I'm so glad that I've had professors who've been able to get up and talk about this openly too, and try to destigmatize that students have needs. We all have needs. And it's okay to ask for help. It's okay to ask and seek for support. And not only that, here's where you can go find it. And you can reach out to me at any time for help with that. So it's kind of really exciting for me to see that in real life, like not just theoretical. Yeah.
Well, and so I think really what's important is that a policy is done in time, or an action is done in time, and it's done in the goodwill and the best work that we know at that time, right? But we have to also be willing as leaders and as practitioners and folks to say, oh, we need to go back and revise that. So I'll use an example. In California, we had basic needs centers, and it said, you want a one-stop model and you want to do this. Well, at the first time, that seemed like the best option, right? But for a lot of faculty who are in their classrooms, who are writing on their syllabus, and to the question in the chat about destigmatizing things, right? Having food and snacks in your classroom, right? And not having custodial say, you can't actually have food in these rooms, right? These are the things that don't make sense sometimes, right? So actually having spaces across campuses so you can grab and go and do things, but some people get so regulatory and say, no, we only need one space on campus. And so, how do we put in the hands of faculty members who want to put the syllabi statement and say, oh, I got a drawer of food stacks here or something like that, that they're not having to pay for that out of their pockets, but we're doing collaborations with our food banks and other things to distribute food to faculty so that they have it readily available. And that begins to bring down the destigmatizing some of the work. And so I just think that we sometimes get in our own way. And so I'm just really, hopeful. And this conversation is making me think about a lot of things that we can be doing together.
Oh, thank you. I have so many other thoughts and questions about that. I've loved it. I visited many community colleges here in Washington State too, where I live, where, you see the food is, students may not go to the main hub, like where the center is. They may only come to the one academic building where their program is housed, where they spend most of their time, where they feel the most comfortable and have the closest relationships with the other students in their program or with their professors. And so when they move those services or the access and bring food into those spaces, it's just normal thing for somebody to walk up and participate and take what they need. I'm looking at time, and this conversation has been so enriching, and I'm so excited to be part of it. And I think if we can just wrap up, I would love to hear from each of you. If there was one thing that you hope the folks who are joined us today, who are listening, could do as a result of listening to this conversation, what would it be?
I would say that budgetary statements of values for your organizations, and ensuring that your budget reflects the values as it relates to students' basic needs. And as we talk about our students, and students are our priority, ensuring that the resources are provided to support our students and their basic needs.
I think, like we were saying in the beginning, be unapologetic for advocating for students. And if you think that people are listening, speak louder, and continue the work and continue to advocate whatever space you are, because we all, our students need us now more than ever.
So hard to have one, and Keith took the best one about budgets or value statements, but I'm gonna have like 1.5.
Okay.
The half is just a plus one on Keith's point, and to say we can't solve all of this immediately, but to figure out what is the strategic opportunity in this moment and on your campus, in your system, in your state, and try to advance the ball there, whether it's on housing or SNAP or, wherever it is, figure out what is that next thing that we can do to make a difference. But the other one I wanted to flag, just because it hadn't come up in the conversation, is there's a set of students who are just above their level of insecurity is significant, but not eligible maybe for some of the public benefit programs. And then one thing happens in their lives and it all unravels. The car breaks down. There's, domestic violence situation. They get out of it, but the books are still in the apartment. And that person needs emergency support of significance, a few $100s, but that can be the difference between staying in school and not. And that's another area that we haven't touched on that I think we can all be advocates for. How do we make sure that those emergency funds are sufficient? And I know in some places the faculty members raise it themselves, which is both really beautiful and also really depressing. Like institutionally, we should be doing a better job.
Yeah, I think having one thing. So I love the two for the plus one. I don't want to know, but I just want to offer this. I think first of all want to say thank you to Sarah for all of her work in supporting the CEOs in California as we started on this journey. And we certainly wouldn't be where we are building out and having the Real College California Coalition. The number of colleges are in here, our 6th annual Basic Needs Summit, and those things happening. But I wanted to say that this is really the arc of the conversation is you have agency in your space, familia, from, you know what I mean? Everybody who's here, you have agency in your space to make a difference, whether it's a syllabi statement, talking about it, elevating a story, or the large scale policy work, but it has to be dogged and continued. It doesn't happen overnight. So we must stay focused together on the fact that this happens over the long term. And I see the fruits of the work that we've been doing nationally, obviously to get federal data. And thank you to Sarah and many advocates who've been doing this work for years, but also to my California colleagues who've been working really hard. And we can see changes that have happened in the legislature and on our colleges, all college campuses. And ultimately that ends up being students. So you have agency and just stay the fight, keep going. Don't give up.
Agency, stay the fight, and don't give up. Thank you so much for that. I think, we have a couple of minutes. I'll keep an eye on the Q&A if there's anything that folks want to ask to see if we can answer live. But I also want to take a moment to call attention to the chat. The chat has been The chat is rich. So if you haven't taken a look at the webinar chat, pull that window up, pull that window open and just see the ideas, resources, comments, experiences that folks are sharing. And Josh, because yours is just the most recent, was the last one I saw, there was a mention of this, the California Basic Needs Summit, and Josh Williams, Joshua at realcollegecalifornia.org. If you have questions about that Real College Basic Needs Summit, he just put the link in the chat and he'll be able to help you out. Sarah, I know you shared quite a few resources from your website too, and maybe we can pull it all together and send it out with a summary. So looks like there's one question in the Q&A, and maybe I'll toss it out to you to see if anyone has an answer. Are there any organizations connecting food and housing insecurity at the collegiate level with overall economic trends and widening wealth gaps in the USA? Campus supports are critical, and I'm curious if any organizations are researching and connecting the systemic causes of these trends. I'm going to throw that out to the entire audience to see if you have any if you have any ideas or resources that you'd like to share. I know we have folks from many different organizations across the country joining us today. This is something that your organization is working on. Definitely drop a note or a link in the chat.
And Leanne, I know you asked me, and Keith just told me that one's on me to answer. And I just have to say, I will just underscore, I think it's a wonderful idea. And I really don't see very many organizations taking it on. And to John's point, this need to speak to a broader audience, even means connecting the dots among so-called various causes, right? And there are those who work on civil rights, and there are those, right, who work even on K-12 education who are not yet part of this conversation. And we do, if we want to be successful, need, frankly, to partner up more in that way. So, I see some strains of what you're talking about in some of the work that Ed Trust has done. I do see that. I see some of it in Demos. I see some of it there's a number of organizations where I can point to moments of it, right? But is it sort of a major priority or strain of work? Maybe not in the way that this person is imagining. And I would also encourage, and that's really what this is designed to do today, is to broaden the group of folks working on this work. Maybe that's something that somebody else wants to take on and bring some leadership to. So I think it was a wonderful question. And I'm watching the chat for answers.
Well, thanks for that. And Sarah, I'll just turn it over to you to thank everyone and help wrap us up.
Yeah, well, I want to just take a moment before you go, Leanne. Thank you so much for your leadership today and in asking great questions and in helping us to facilitate a really robust conversation. Folks, it's been a tough week in a lot of different ways. And I know there've been a lot of tough weeks, but this has been a really, really long one. Painful one in many ways. And so, I just want to really say thank you to our panelists who have taken time out. That includes you, Tracy, and for being here, and to all of you who took the time today to work on this and think about this with us, even though I'm sure you have a level of exhaustion, and such that you're sitting with as well. And it is Friday, and it's Friday afternoon here on the East Coast. I have learned a tremendous amount from every single one of you who's joined us here today, not only today, but in the past. And I just have to say that this could never be the work of a single person. I mean, it never has been. In fact, what we really are dealing with is the amount of work that students have had to put in long before anybody even noticed that work, just to even continue to persist in higher ed and be there so they could tell these stories. And as someone who has now got the immense privilege of showing up every week with community college students, I just can't tell you how much the urgency is there and how little time we have to waste. To John's point, many of them, even those who don't appear to look like they need help need it very badly and are really on the knife's edge of dropping out. So, I really appreciate everything everyone had to say here today. Jeff, if you'll put up my final slide, I will issue a little bit of a call to action because I think we'd be remiss not to. And I appreciate Michelle and Leanne and everyone at Education Northwest who have also underlined the importance of a call to action and supported this webinar today. We want to underline 5 different things as we conclude. First, there's a need for continued education, including of federal policymakers, and they need education to support legislation to address students' basic needs. And there are a set of them who have been wonderful champions and continue to be, but the number of them needs to grow. And this doesn't need to be a partisan issue. In fact, it really shouldn't be. It should be a bipartisan effort because there are so many wins for so many communities, whether it's in rural areas and agricultural areas or others. There are real wins for all sorts of folks with bridging the gap here and helping students be able to make ends meet so that they can just get an education they need in order to live in our democracy and our economy. Secondly, we really do have a continued need to educate the higher education sector and subsectors on the need to support students. I saw some of you in the chat today saying, I'm not at an institution that really understands this yet, or I'm one of only a few people at my institution who really gets this. And I don't think that we should, make an assumption that, for example, even every community college gets this at this point. We know we don't yet have, for example, public benefits access on every campus. And so there's work to do there. There's also a lot of work to be done with potential partner organizations in communities across the country about the need to support students and also about the best ways to do that. This is a tricky area of work. It sounds great to work with your community, but it's easier said than done. There was a wonderful question today about MOUs, and Keith, you referenced an MOU that you did a lot of hard work on in order to be able to share data in order to support students. And we need more examples of those because, that is really how we codify relationships now, are through these documents, and they can make or break relationships. The fourth one, and I heard a lot about this today, and I'm so glad because this is a big part of where I'm spending my time lately. But, John, I really appreciate your call to educate the public further about who students really are now and what they're going through, because we still continue to talk way too much about 12 institutions that educate less than 1% of students. And we continue to reference students living in dorms and going to parties when only a tiny fraction ever have that kind of opportunity. It's incredible to me how much we're not talking about unemployment among students, even as we talk about them working. And we're not talking about the elder care responsibilities of our students, even as we talk about childcare. There's just so much more to say. And lastly, we need to continue, and this is a call for researchers because this is fundamentally a conversation about new data. We need to continue to use new lenses as we analyze students' challenges and opportunities. There have been some really wonderful critical studies coming out, for example, challenging concepts like resilience as a framework for thinking about students and why they are making it through or not. And we need to continue to see more of that, innovative lens as we examine data. If you have things to share that you have put together or research that you want to see done, this is something that I know that Education Northwest would love to engage with you on. So with that, that's the call to action. I hope that you all have at least a short list of things to do. I know that my papers are all covered in notes, and I really want to again say thank you to everyone who took the time this afternoon. We will be sending out information afterwards, follow-ups from today. Leanne's contact information is there on the slide. Again, I want to underline how thrilled we all are to have Leanne joining the team, a team that has been doing wonderful work under Michelle Hodar and Chris Mazzio's leadership for quite a while and continues to grow. And that you can expect to hear a lot more about how we can address student basic needs from Education Northwest going forward. So I hope you all have a wonderful, wonderful weekend and that you get the rest and rejuvenation and care that you all need. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks so much. Thanks for joining us today.
Have a great weekend, guys.
You too.
Bye.